Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of this seminar. Yesterday we had a lecture and a conversation, and we had a debate, and that was good, because that was one of the objectives of this seminar, to let people participate and speak out. And this way, I'm confident that we will create consciousness and we will create participation. Today we continue. We continue with the first conversation on energy. And for this I invited from the UK, Chris Goodall. Please come take the stand. And Ivancic. He's from Serbia, but he already lives in Barcelona for 15 years. 20 plus. It's a long time. Why talk about energy? Well, yesterday, of course, we established within sustainability some urgencies. And climate change and CO2 emissions is just one element of a whole broad concept of sustainability, but it's urgent. It is what will cause the most direct impacts on our life in the coming years, coming decades and centuries. It is the most tangible problem that we have right now. So the energy and CO2 reduction discussion is always there. Why Alex and why Chris? Well, Alex, as I said, he studied engineering in Belgrado, and then he came to Barcelona where he did his PhD. And he did it on the implementation of sustainable energy infrastructures, and that means that Alex works on a big level, on an urban level, and thus he became technical director of Barcelona Regional, and there he wrote the plan for energetic improvement, which was accepted by the City Council in 2002. And this plan received the European Climate Star Award. And all the experiences that he had on different energy networks, they led to this beautiful little book, Energyscapes. I would like to show it, because it makes you aware of how much our world has changed and has been, has suffered impacts from the whole fossil fuel system that we erected since Watt invented the steam machine, more or less. These conclusions make you aware that it's relative, maybe what we are heading for right now, which is the transition to less carbon energy systems. Alex right now works also as he was a founding partner at energy consultancy Ivancic in Barcelona, and he lectures at different universities, Princeton amongst them. So that's why Alex is here. And Chris studied in Cambridge, but he did an MBA after that at Harvard. And as a member of the British Green Party, and in his website Carbon Commentaries, he tries to translate rigorous concepts on energy to the daily life of people in the UK. And how directly is this transition of ideas to his daily life? Well, he came by train, because of course that's less CO2 emissions than if you go by plane. It takes a day, but it's comfortable. You realize you can
very comfortable indeed.
You can work in the train,
yeah.
So it's. I'm jealous that you can do these voyages like that. He did a book, How to Lead a Low Carbon Life. This is really implementing it in the life of a normal citizen, which won the Clarion Award for non-fiction. And the New Scientist called it the definitive guide to reducing your carbon footprint. So it's like a manual that everybody might use for himself. And when he puts into perspective, like also in this book, Sustainability, All That Matters, where he treats not only energy, but also metal. We talked about that yesterday. He also talks about food. He also talks about clothes. Then some, well, misunderstandings appear, some contradictions, and that's when things get interesting, and that's when you really discover where you should focus your actions on. And I think this kind of discussions are very, very healthy at this moment where we are right now. And I wanted to start with Chris, because you come from the UK, and in the UK there is right now a Department of Energy and Climate Change, it is called. So the British government seems very well aware that and they express it so explicitly, that energy and climate change is worth having a minister dedicated to that cause.
Yes, and it causes the most extraordinary conflict between the various parts of this government department. On the one side, the energy department, the civil servants, the people who work on energy, their job is to make sure that the UK's natural fossil fuel resources are extracted as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So that means licensing more oil exploration in the North Sea, trying to encourage continued exploration for coal and for natural gas. The extraordinarily important political issue in Britain at the moment concerns fracking. The UK has very large potential resources of shale gas and shale oil. So that part of the energy department is all about encouraging the most rapid exploration possible and the extraction of as much fossil fuel and therefore eventually burning and creating carbon dioxide as possible. On the other side of the government department sits the people who are most worried about how best to quickly and cheaply decarbonize, that is to say, reduce the consumption of fossil fuel. So inside this one government department, you have a series of continuing conflicts, arguments, debates, and occasionally it flares up between the government ministers responsible for each side of the problem. There is no resolution. By putting energy and climate change into one government department, nothing has been solved. All that we've done is make the conflict between our continuing need for cheap fossil fuels to sustain our living standards and the eventual need to completely and totally stop using coal, oil and gas. That conflict has been made clearer and clearer by the continuing debates, disputes and dissension within that central government department.
Yep. I think one very significant document that was made some years ago by the eminent Professor David Mackay. It might be good to call upon that for one moment. David Mackay, he was scientific director at that department, but he is going out.
No, David is still the scientific director of the Department of Energy and Climate Change. I suspect he is deeply frustrated in that role. Because he finds that the government is not pursuing sensible policies, and he will go back to being Professor of Energy Physics at University of Cambridge.
What Mr. Mackay did in this document, which I really advise to everybody here, it's freely downloadable, www, without hot air. The document is called Renewables Without Hot Air. So without all the fuss, without all the prejudices that are involving this whole discussion. What he very simply does is that he goes through all the possible consumptions that a UK citizen might cause, and he puts on the other side the balance of all the possible sources of renewable energies, and then he comes to some conclusions. And then he comes up with a whole sum of possible renewable energy sources that add up to what the UK might need per person. And then he translates it into this, it also makes you a little bit scary, into this map on what this implies for the UK. I mean, it suggests that you should turn over the whole country to be able to live on renewables. Are we really aiming for something realistic? But when I saw this map, I had already read the book of Alex, and then you see what we already did to the world with all our fossil systems. If I go from Rotterdam to the coast, that's 25 kilometers, I see nothing but industry dedicated to fossil fuels. So maybe there's a lot of woods also in this. So the map is maybe a little bit misleading. It is.
I think it's very misleading.
It is very misleading. And Alex, if you see this, do you think it's a realistic aim on?
I think that reality is very tough. So, is it realistic? While we have a society which is so hungry for energy, and while we are so much in this planet, something is going to happen. If we want to live with the consumption and demand we are having today, it's going to be realistic. If not, I mean, we are going to learn to live in different way. But you know, the society is consuming tremendous amounts of energy. For example, I'm using quite, I mean, for me, nice comparison, saying that one of the old ancient world miracles, which is Great Pyramid of Giza, we are spending in 1 week in Barcelona. And Barcelona is quite efficient city. We are not too much. We are 1.5 million, more or less. And we have mild climate. We have compact city, which not so many mobility needs. And we are still consuming a miracle a week. So imagine all the world. Imagine mega cities. Imagine other places which are not so in so benign climate, like Masdar we saw yesterday. This kind of tricky example. So while we are expecting to continue living in such way, this should be reality. I mean, there are other realities possible, but they're not. I mean, the image is going to be more or less the same, but painted in gray or brown. So whatever you prefer, brown or gray, but it's just a question of color. I mean, it doesn't mean. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, the balance is like this.
Chris, maybe you also prepared some things on what is this land occupation. Maybe we should go through some of these slides.
The crucial issue faced by every country that seeks to reduce and eventually eliminate the use of carbon-based fuels, oil, gas, and coal, is that to generate enough energy for the modern society, even a much more efficient society than we have at the moment, requires huge areas of land. At current efficient rates of collection of renewable energy, whether it be wind or tide or wave or PV, we're only going to get about 3 watts per square meter. It varies, of course, between different parts of the world, but that's a reasonable average for wind and for solar. Now, on average, a citizen of a developed Western economy needs about 120 kilowatt hours of energy a day. And you can see, therefore, that 3 watts per square meter of collection capacity, you need a lot of square meters for each citizen before you can give that person a standard of living comparable to what he or she is receiving today. Just in terms of electricity, and remember that we need a lot more energy than electricity. Electricity is a pretty small fraction of our total energy needs. We need, on average, 40 billion watts in the UK for 60 million or so people. That means we need, through those calculations, to devote about 6% of the UK, possibly 8%, possibly 5%, but around this number, purely to the collection of energy. Now, David Mackay's chart, which Sander has just shown, makes it look much worse than that. The actual reality is that if a country like Britain, which is very densely populated, wanted to generate all the electricity it needed from wind and solar photovoltaics, it would need to give over about 6% of the country. And I've represented this on this chart here. This is the windiest place in Europe. It's one of the windiest places in the world, the west coast of Scotland. We could, if we wanted to, as a society, devote the whole of the west of Scotland to the generation of electricity. You may not believe this, but this is pretty sunny down here as well. Sunnier than Barcelona today, by the way. And if we were to put solar photovoltaic farms across the whole of that area, which has limited agricultural value, but is some of the most expensive real estate in Europe, in the prosperous parts of Britain, we could altogether provide all our needs for electricity. It isn't going to happen. And even worse, electricity is only a small fraction of our total needs. If we wanted to provide all our energy needs, this is roughly how much we'd have to give over. We'd have to turn the whole of Wales into a forest plantation, which, interestingly, there's quite a move to do, simply because Welsh upland land has no farming value anymore, and we'd have to give over the whole of the south of England to PV and the whole of Scotland and the islands to the north of Scotland over to wind. That is not politically possible in the UK, as resistance to the growth of renewable energy becomes more and more acute. This is a political problem which is unsolvable. We sit, in the United Kingdom, we sit about here, and I suspect this is Spain here, although it's not said. This is from David Mackay's wonderful, wonderful book. I mean, as Sander was saying, it's very easy to go through. It tells you exactly everything about the energy infrastructure the world needs. And even if we say that instead of having 3 watts per square meter, which is what I say we can generate, we only get 1, even countries as big as China, physically as big as China, would struggle to develop enough land mass to provide the energy, that 120 kilowatt hours a day that we need.
Chris, may I? I mean, I like this format, so I would like just to make a comment. Do you think we should scare about the fact that we need to dedicate 20% of land to energy production? Yep, it's a political problem nowadays, but generally, I mean, which part of my body is devoted to energy balance I mean, in order to be alive?
Yes.
More than 20%.
Yep.
So where's the problem?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need to discuss this, to expose this, and to say clearly, well, come on, this is the equation, and this is pure physics.
Yeah.
There are 3 bottom line conditions, in my opinion. The first one is power density you're talking about, which is very important. I mean, the density of the energy you can harvest over the surface, square meter. There is another one, which is energy return of energy investment, means how many energy you need to invest in order to take energy, to harvest it, being it fossil fuel, being it renewable or whatever. Means you need to get more energy that you're investing, because if you're taking less or very few, then you're doing nonsense. And third one is the capacity factor. How long you can use your resource over the time. So question of Sander is looking for energy return of energy investment. Please put this one. Yeah. So this is a kind of slides where we are looking at the percentage of energy we need to invest in order to take a unit of energy. So if you look at the lower slide, which is the evolution of gas and oil, means historically it used to be very good return of investment. With very few energy, you get very much. But as the best sources are being deployed, we are moving on this curve, and we are getting less and less energy from the oil, for example.
Alex,
so,
can I just say, so may I make sure I understand?
Yeah, of course, please.
This means that for every unit of energy you invest in collecting the energy, you get 50 units
over
back
it.
in terms of power.
Yeah, and we are starting at 1, where is, I mean, I invest 1 and I get 1, means nonsense. I mean, I'm doing just nothing. And if we look at, for example, at tar sands, which are Canada is very rich in tar sands, and it's now recognized as the second world richest country in oil resources, but not by underground oil as is traditional oil wells, but tar sands, which is extremely inefficient in terms of energy return of energy investment. Here we have, for example, a kind of solar, depending on the climate you have, wind, nuclear, and so on. Sorry. This is the different sources, and this is historic move of the oil, which is very interesting, and this indicates us that oil, even if the total depletion is not really something which is going to happen very soon, the price is rising, because besides these 3 physical criteria I'm commenting, which is energy return of energy investment, power density, and capacity factor, there is another question, which is economy.
Just one thing, nuclear is just as efficient as tar sands.
It depends.
And less than sugarcane.
I mean, I'm using these slides which are taken from different sources, and there is a kind of debate where we should. I prefer to use this at the moment just like a tool to explain what we are talking about. If nuclear is on 6 or 16, we can discuss. It depends a lot, because also nuclear energy, well, let's discuss a bit further. But what is interesting also in this slide is that definitely conventional fuels, especially fossil, are getting worse and worse positions. So they are needing more and more energy investment to take the unit, while the renewables, because of progress of technology, are performing better. I am saying that these absolute numbers, I do not agree completely with them, but the trend is like this, in my opinion.
It's funny to see these trends. I mean, we're always talking about the process, so one might.
And if I may, just another slide in order to complement the very good explanation Chris commented, which is power density. So we realize that what is offered by the renewable sources, biomass, wind, solar, have relatively low power density versus what we really need, which is, I mean, industry, high-rise buildings, or whatever. Pay attention, this is a logarithmic scale, so it's changing very quickly. So we need more or less 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more than we can get from biomass, for example, for our city. Or we need at least 1 order of magnitude more in terms of photovoltaics to supply our cities.
Chris, this whole nuclear discussion, because we say that CO2 is an emission is an urgent thing. We have the nuclear option, which is generating waste that is very serious, but it is not emitting CO2. So you at times defended that nuclear, a lot of people agree that nuclear is one of the options in the whole energy mix that will have a place. you defended that we shouldn't be so negative
No.
towards it.
No.
You
No,
did some
I think
forecasts.
I make a controversial statement, and I hope people will disagree with me. I think nuclear is an environmentally friendly method of generating power. I'll say that again, because it is, to me, a very important issue that we need as Western society to face. I believe that nuclear power stations are environmentally friendly. The use of enriched uranium in nuclear power stations generates waste. At the end of the life of the power station, it is very expensive to take the power station out of action and return the land around it to its original state. These are the problems of nuclear power: waste disposal and decommissioning of nuclear power stations. They are the only problems with nuclear power, other than the fact that Western society, not Chinese society, nor Taiwanese society, finds it very expensive to build nuclear power stations. And I have some charts here to show what's happened to the cost of nuclear power in France over the last 40 years. But environmentally, nuclear power has the potential to be extremely beneficial because it uses very little space. This is a particularly important thing in Britain, in the United Kingdom, because for reasons I don't particularly well understand, England has an astonishing attitude towards its landscape. It is increasingly finding it difficult to accept solar panels on fields to generate electricity. There is an enormous movement to ban large-scale wind turbines, even though in Britain we have an enormous resource of wind. About 40% of the EU's total resource of wind flows over the British Isles. But British people are increasingly resistant to large-scale wind farms. Therefore, I say, we have to have a look at nuclear. Nuclear doesn't use much space. It is not visually intrusive. It seems to be politically possible. Those of us who are very worried about the future of the world in face of climate change have to accept, I believe, that nuclear power may be an important option to explore because of the factors that I've just been talking about. We face a problem. France, which has put more nuclear power reactors in place than any other country in Europe, and at one stage was providing almost all its electricity from nuclear power, used to be able to build nuclear power stations for 1,000 euros per kilowatt of capacity. A kilowatt of capacity is roughly equivalent to half a kettle, a boiling kettle. That price continues to rise. In 2000, when the last of the first generation of reactors was completed, it was roughly double what it had been. And this, of course, is after the effects of inflation. France is currently building another nuclear reactor to a new advanced design on the Normandy coast in the north of France. It was expected 6 years ago to cost less than 4,000 euros per kilowatt. The expected cost now, when it's completed, and that's several years away, is at least 5 and probably 6, and frankly, I guess, 8,000 euros. In other words, we're likely to see an 8-fold multiplication of the cost of building a power station in a country which has built a lot of them. This is not the first time France has done it. And as Alex said, there is evidence that nuclear power and fossil fuels have become more expensive to build in terms of the energy return that you get for the energy that you invest in building it and creating the concrete and so on and so forth. This is the experience in France, and this is what the experience has been in the United States, a very similar pattern. much cheaper in the 1950s and the 1960s than it is today. In fact, across the Western world, nuclear power stations are generally becoming more expensive to build, at the same time as we're seeing very rapid reductions in the cost of installing photovoltaic power and quite fast reductions in the cost of building wind turbines. However, it doesn't have to be like this. For reasons we very imperfectly understand, the Chinese look as though they are able to build the same designs of reactors in China for less than a third of the cost that it's likely to cost a European manufacturer to build a nuclear power station in Europe. Now, labor costs in China are still considerably lower than they are in Europe, but that's only a very partial explanation. But we're also seeing that one type of new nuclear power station being built in the United States, and I think this is the only one, the one at Vogtle, is being built for less than half the cost of a nuclear power station in France. The point I'm trying to make is people are getting very pessimistic about the cost of building nuclear, and that's one of the core reasons why governments and to some extent citizens are moving against nuclear power around Western Europe. But we have to put the nuclear power in context. Although solar, photovoltaic, and wind are becoming cheaper and in some places becoming competitive with conventional sources of electricity generation, it's still more expensive to build a wind farm in a windy place such as Western Scotland than it is to build a nuclear power station. So these are my estimates. These are contentious estimates, and I wouldn't suggest that they were perfectly precise. But I put them down here to illustrate the point that wind or photovoltaics in good European locations, Spain for photovoltaics, Scotland for wind, is still no more expensive than the apparently unbelievably expensive nuclear reactor at Flamanville, and considerably more expensive than the world's best examples of nuclear power construction, the ones that are going on in China, and China's investing enormously in the creation of nuclear power stations, and that single plant in the United States. So the economic argument I'm trying to say here against nuclear power stations is ambiguous. We cannot be certain that nuclear power isn't the cheapest way of generating electricity. And around Europe, but particularly in places like Denmark and Germany, citizens are becoming increasingly concerned about the price they have to pay for electricity. If you're really, really concerned about climate change, I think you should be watching public opinion in Northern Europe, which is saying, hang on, we're spending huge sums on wind and in solar. Is this the cheapest way of doing so? Because if we get to the point where electorates in democracies reject wind and solar because it's too expensive or too erratic, we run the risk of being stuck with coal, oil, and gas for the next generation.
Alex.
Well, Chris, I'm afraid I'm going to disagree, but actually this is the point of this debate. I mean, you mentioned two reasons, global reasons. One is environmental friendliness, and the second is economics. And I'm afraid I'm not agree with none of them. Because if we are talking about environmental friendliness, your approach is clear, and it's very, very correct if you're placing your attention on your country, which is Western developed country, which is consuming a lot, as we are, here in Spain and looking for their own landscape. Great Britain, which is a cradle of capability brown, beginning of landscaping and shaping artificially the nature in order to be beautiful. So in British culture, there is deep appreciation to this, and it's okay. But what would say Capability Brown if he would see the mining pits of uranium in Kazakhstan or in Australia? I mean, we are appreciating our landscape, but some other landscape is going to suffer. And I think it's not fair. It's not fair to act like this because I think the world is changing and we need to have a broader scope and not as we used to do historically, both British and Spanish, conquering the world. So I think in this sense that we are both taking the resource from some place which we don't mind, and later on we are also going to put the waste in some place which is nobody knows where. As it's happening with the IT waste in China or in Africa or in such places. So I think this position is very, very okay from our point of view, from Western developed societies, but if we are taking care about the planet as a whole, it's not the complete vision. On the economy, I would say Chris explained this very well, but I have something which is essentially similar, but still I like to show it, which is what we call learning curves. Learning curves, technological learning curves, means how technology performs when it is developing. Yeah, this one. So this is a PV learning curve which is extremely rapid. Every time we double the quantity of technology which is produced and installed, the average price of the cost of technology is decreasing. And this is something which is very well known in different technological development, from engines, aircrafts, and also, of course, energy technologies. So almost all the technologies, here is the example of PV, which is the most radical one in the last time because it's decreasing really quickly somehow. So all of them are decreasing. But what happens with nuclear? It's the same what Chris already shown, but a bit different representing. So this is the learning curve of French experience in the last, more or less 40 years or something like this. So what can we do with the technology which has negative learning curve, which means every time is more and more expensive? The technology which is in Western conditions, means Europe and the States, tripling the initial estimation of the costs and doubling the time of making centrales. So the Finnish one, which is still in construction, and for me it's a very interesting example. Even I don't like to pay attention just to one case. I prefer, but as an illustration, the Finnish one, which is, by the way, the private investment. I think it's the first one which is privately driven. It was initially approved in the year 2000 with expectation to be ready in 2010. The present estimation is that it's going to work between 2018 and 2020. So the time of production, making the central, is double. Initial cost was about, I would say, 3.3 thousand euros per kilowatt, and now the present estimation is about 10,000. So the upper point.
That's almost like architecture.
Hmm?
It's almost like architecture at times.
Yeah, more or less. So this is the reality of a Finnish plant built by Areva, French company, who is very experienced in making these plants. I'm not saying that this is only due to the technological problems or technological traps or whatever. It's also because the society is changing and our attitude towards the technology is changing. And this is definitely a very important point, and I would say the also important fact when we are reflecting on what's going on in China. If you compare the prices in China and in Europe in 70s, they're quite similar. But I would say that the life or social conditions in China now and in Europe in 70s are much more similar than what we are having now and what we are going to have in Western world. Because China, it's not market-driven economy. It's almost Soviet economy in terms of planning of such kind of infrastructures. Can we imagine this kind of planning in Western world? Can we imagine, let's say, the same approach to the new, very, very important infrastructures in such way? I don't believe really, because this technology is very well if you have a 5-year planning like in Soviet times. It's perfect. But in our approach, for me, it's nonsense. Because if you also think about liberalization of energy markets, it's supposed that it's going to be paid by private money. It's supposed, I don't know. But in the end of the day, you see that first investment estimation is supposed to be paid by private money, but then there increases, and usually they're covered by public money. And I think that Western citizens are not prepared to pay for this. And if you have to pay same amount of money, I prefer to pay for something which is renewable than to nuclear. Of course, there is also very big part of perception and subjective approach. Even you can put some numbers and you can say, okay, this is good option. And if you analyze nuclear, I recognize you can always show that it's reasonable option. But I would say that there is also a big, social perception, which is also very, very important, and which is a key issue in this increase of prices.
One thing on the, we're talking right now a lot about the generation of energy. I also want to know of the both of you. This is about how we produce. There's something about how we consume. The consumption of energy, we are, because now we are, as architects, are also very directly involved. We are designing, and we are able to design buildings that use a lot less energy, and this we start to notice. Technologies and habits of people. Do we really have to prepare for all these terrible things that we announce on the generation, because shouldn't we work on the efficiency? Well, we are working on it. But
of course, the question should be to look on all the value chain of energy production and consumption, and even more on different drivers or different carriers of energy, because now we are talking about energy. What is energy? I mean, it's extremely complex, and there are so many technologies, so many applications, and yeah, we have no time to segregate and to talk more in details. But we are talking of extremely complex stuff. So power generation, power utility, if you want, nothing to do with oil. It's very different business, different behavior, different consumption. But okay. Anyhow, I think that actually at the present moment, talking about context, this is big context, but going more to the immediate context of what is architect's environment, I would talk much more about the demand and demand reduction and efficiency, actually, because we need to cope with both sides. I mean, how we produce and how we consume. For me, to me, and I believe to a lot of people, there are much more unknowns on the production side, how we are going to produce, and less unknowns on how we are going to try to reduce the demand, at least in theory. So what we can immediately do is to work on the demand side. And this is one of the slides I'm usually trying to put in front of my students in order to explain that architectural students that you should not start with renewables. You can eventually end with renewables because this is a kind of cherry on the pie, but you need the pie. Because if you start putting some gadgets, then they're just gadgets, and they're arriving to reduce the consumption in 1%, 0.5%, 3%, even 10%. But you're never going to have what we are now calling, and the legislation is going to that, which is near zero energy building or net zero energy building. If you want to work really in this concept, you need to try to reduce the demand, means decrease, then put efficiency, efficient transformation and use of energy, then try to reuse waste energy, not recycle, because energy cannot be recycled due to the second principle of thermodynamics, but you can reuse it in cascade in some cases, and then to start with renewables. This is just the final part you should add. I mean, this slide is.
It's also for architects and also urban planners. The advantage is obviously it's not to be seen when people in Britain are opposed to seeing wind turbines, when they are opposed to seeing things. The good thing of demand reduction is that it should be an almost invisible thing.
Energy is invisible. This is one of the main problems, because we use it, we consume it, but it's invisible.
Indeed, indeed. We see the energy bills, we see the invoices from the suppliers, but we don't see the bills. I'd like to respond on the demand reduction issue. I come from Northern Europe. The principal energy need in Northern Europe, and it's particularly true in Britain, is for heating domestic housing in winter. In Britain, approximately 50%, one half, of all energy used is to heat and to a limited extent cool buildings. So if you can't get hold of that problem, you can't reduce energy consumption significantly in a Northern European country. In Britain, we have the oldest housing stock in Europe. 20% of our housing was built more than 100 years ago, before the start of the First World War. As you can imagine, that housing stock is extremely inefficient to heat. And the cost of improving that housing stock so that it became more efficient is greater, considerably greater, than the cost of generating more energy. In other words, there is no economic imperative, at least in a country with the structure of energy prices that we do in Britain, there is no economic incentive whatsoever for a householder to spend money refurbishing his or her house to make it more energy efficient. In Britain and in most other countries of Europe, relatively few new buildings are being built. Our populations have stabilized, or close to stabilized. Our economies are growing much less fast than they did in the 1970s. And as a result, the turnover, the need for new buildings is very limited. So our scope, particularly in Northern Europe, to reduce energy consumption by changing our buildings to more accurate, to more collect, to use less energy and to not waste it, our ability to do that is very, very limited indeed. And we should be under no doubt that demand reduction, energy demand reduction, in a Northern European country is an extremely difficult and extremely expensive thing to do. But the last point, and I'll shut up then, is that Britain has these curious features. I talked about the reverence for landscape landscape that, as Alex said, was actually created mostly in the 17th and 18th centuries. But you cannot, in Britain, touch that landscape. The other thing you can't do is touch a house built in the 19th century. You cannot affect its exterior appearance in most parts of Britain. So householders who own a house built in the reign of Queen Victoria, perhaps 150 years ago, which has an energy consumption approximately 20 times what a modern house would have per unit of surface area, 20 times, you are not allowed to replace the windows on many of these houses to install double glazing. That is because of the peculiar, strange attachment British people have towards those houses built in the reign of Queen Victoria. Now, obviously, we should do something about that, and architects should be at the forefront of this move by stressing how wonderful modern housing is. However, in conservative countries, and frankly, most countries are conservative, that is impossible to do because of the reverence for either landscape or for domestic architecture.
We know them, these houses in England, that the window is only consists of, or the glass consists of one single sheet of 3 millimeters.
Yeah.
And the people do really not care when they get their invoice if they see the costs of and the benefits of insulating. This does not create awareness.
Well, in many places you would not be allowed to change it. Planning regulations would stop you. If that's not the case, you want to retain as much as you can of the external appearance. Your pride, your pleasure in your home is very strongly determined in Britain by its age. A house built 150 years ago is worth generally twice as much on the open property market as a house built today per unit of surface area.
Okay, yeah. I want to get down to prices for a moment because it is a great incentive. It should be a great incentive. But there's always one word floating above this whole discussion, the carbon tax. The fact that we are not paying what we should be paying because we are polluting. The whole discussion about the costs, they will all change if there will be some effective system placed, imposed by the European Union, maybe, that will make us aware of what we cause. You speak about the consequences of uranium mines in Central Asia. We don't see them. These externalities that we are not obliged to face the consequences.
But when we come to this issue, the question is who is going to implement this first? Because
the first one
is going to suffer a lot.
Yeah.
You see what's going on in Germany. The people is complaining about energy power prices because they are interpreting that it's due to the renewables, due to the nuclear
green shift.
But actually, in the last 5 years, the power price in Germany is halved. So it's 50% that what used to be in 2008. But the people is still complaining.
Yeah.
So if you put this kind of carbon tax, China is not going to put this. So how your economy is going to be competitive? I mean, here, talking about energy and energy models, you need always to look on what's going on with the economy. And not only with the economy of energy, but with the global economy. For example, we are talking about, here in this city, I'm told as a citizen that it's bad to use the car, it's polluting, we have good climate, compact city. Why don't you go on foot, walking? And I'm doing this. But what is the consequence? Then the state is saying me, renew your car. take your car, have new car, because we have a lot of people which is, living, having salaries by car industry, automotive industry. So it's a kind of message: buy car, put it in the garage because it's you cannot have it in the street, and go on foot. Am I stupid? No, I'm not. I don't have car. But if you look, some 14 million people in Europe is working in automotive industry. More than 5% of employed people in Europe and in the States should be very similar, and in Asia, in some countries also, is working from automotive industry. So if you say, we are not going to use oil anymore, we are not going to move in the same way and patterns, then what's going on to happen with these millions of people and families?
There will
It's a
some economy
it's social
substituting
but you need to
the
build
old economy.
You need to build this kind of new economic activities, and it's not immediate. Then when we are expecting that something is going to change in 5 years time or 10 years time is completely impossible. I mean, our energy system and together with our society is being built in the last 150, 120 years by layers, oil, carbon, electricity, this direct current, alternative. Direct current network was present in Manhattan till more or less 8 years ago or 10 years ago. And it was implemented at the end of 19th century. So the changes are very, very slow, and we cannot expect abrupt change in all the architecture of the system. We need to add new layers, new technological layers in order to perform better, to involve new resources, and to be more efficient, but not to change everything, because it's going to cost so much money that it's impossible to do.
I'm afraid because the urgency is so big.
Yeah, but the inertia of the system is very slow. I mean, Václav Smil, who is very recognized author about energy issues, advisor of many people and governments, he's showing that the new resource of energy to become from discovery or technological or putting in the market the new resource, to become what he called master resource, means to have more 20% or 30% of share in the total pie of energy consumption. It needs more or less 50 to 80 years or 100 years. So oil, first oil well was done in 1859, same year Serda applied Champla, and oil became dominant, means with the biggest share in the energy resources in 1960 something. So we called the 20th century century of oil. It's not century of oil, it's century of carbon. Still.
I suppose that we provoked some reactions also amongst the public.
Hopefully.
Because I think of some people that I have over here. But does anybody want to ask something? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have a question for every sentence you said, but we don't have time. To sum up, I think the biggest limits resulted to be a political and a society problem. People are not willing to reduce their habits. They're not willing to reduce their what they usually do, regardless the ecological footprint. And politicians are elected by citizens, so this closed the loop. Where is the getaway?
I always hope that it is in economics, that if we do things more efficiently, that we will notice. But I will give the word to somebody who knows about that. Peter Sweetman, he will talk, well, in like a quarter of an hour, but he already stopped.
Yeah, no, so I couldn't resist. Chris, I just wanted to go back on your figures because I felt that your chart talking about costs was a little deceptive. I didn't notice the source, but the traditional way of looking at the cost of renewable power and comparing it against other sources is called the long-term cost of energy. I'm sure you're aware of it. February 2014, there were around 40 international peer-reviewed studies of the long-term cost of energy from the different energy sources. And of course, I only quote a couple, but Fraunhofer Institute, one of the most well-known laboratories studying this in Germany, quoted the levelized cost of energy for current onshore wind power at being 1,000 to 1,800 euros per kilowatt hour, which I think was about a third of the column that you'd showed in your chart. And I just wanted to, perhaps I've got the figures wrong, but I'll listen to your response. And I wanted to see where you thought Hinkley C contract for difference at £92.50 per megawatt hour, I guess, would be of power output from when that is built, if it's built on time and according to budget, etc. So I just don't know. So I didn't think your graph explained particularly well things like the fact that Brazil, with no subsidies for wind power, having open PPA auctions, is choosing wind over all other technologies at the moment. In other words, it could have chosen coal, and the Brazilians, as you can tell from the protests against the football at the moment, are very interested in where their money gets spent, and they're putting in renewable power. And I actually know solar developers in this country who would love to build new solar in Spain unsubsidized at the moment, and one of the main reasons they can't is due to dispatchability, renewable regulations, and the fact that other technologies are supported in other means. So I think that there's a different story from the one that you're describing. And for example, if Europe had a fully interconnected energy market, then constructing solar in Spain and transporting the energy power to UK would be, and indeed is, the fundamental platform of the 2050 roadmap for energy transmission in Europe, which is to the benefit of everybody, which is reducing everybody's bills, and has been thoroughly proven. And then finally, I couldn't let go by either your comment, which I love the way that particularly British politicians play to the crowd with respect to energy efficiency. British homes are indeed extremely inefficient, and it is extremely cheap to treat many of them. So there's a category in the UK called hard-to-treat homes. And people who stand up in public love to point to Victorian buildings and say how very difficult and expensive it would be to renovate them, and they're right. But the other thing they forget to mention is that that's only 20% of our housing stock. And our housing stock in the UK is full of extremely ugly terraced buildings which can be treated extremely cheaply, and where the paybacks for energy efficiency are extremely immediate, and where millions of homes have actually been treated in the recent past. So I guess there is, a different story, which, if you choose to look at it, you will. And in fact, I would argue, because I also know something about the way in which the government models work with respect to energy efficiency. At the moment, if you're interested in taking out an energy efficiency loan, you're forced to make an assumption, which is that energy prices will not increase. Which is bizarre when you think that the people who are most likely to do energy efficiency measures are those most likely to be worried about the future increase of prices of energy. Now, this in mathematics is a very important distinction, because it's, on the one hand, the government is able to write a contract for difference showing a power increase of approximately double for Hinkley C, assuming therefore that the prices of power in 10 years' time, when Hinkley C begins to produce, will be around 92 pounds per kilowatt hour. And yet, if you wish to take out an energy efficiency loan, for example, you're forced to make an assumption, which is the prices will not increase, which of course doesn't make the numbers look very attractive for a lot of homes. So
Peter,
those are my points.
Yeah, okay. Next, you still have things to tell afterwards also, but Chris, I also had this idea. I mean, like the 20% of Victorian buildings, we should get to the big part of the buildings built in the 50s and the 60s. We as architects to lower demand. I think. Please answer.
it would be wrong of me to get too involved in the particular circumstances of the United Kingdom, which has its own eccentricities and absurdities. And as I always do, I overstated the strength of my case in order to elicit reaction.
Okay.
I'm sorry for that.
No, that's provocative, but that's good.
So can I just very briefly talk through some of the things that were raised there? Cost of renewables. The chart I showed was the cost of renewables in terms of capital cost per unit of generated energy put onto an equivalent basis. I'm sorry this is slightly technical. I was trying to say implicitly, and I couldn't talk through it in detail, is that the typical wind turbine onshore in a windy place generates about a third of what its nameplate, the stated capacity of the wind turbine is. And I've adjusted those capital cost figures for that. So apologies if that wasn't made completely clear. On the issue of whether renewables have a lower cost today than any alternative source of energy, there are clearly examples now around the world where unsubsidized renewables are able to enter into the electricity market and obtain a return for their investors. No question about that at all. There are some parts of the United States, for example, large parts of the United States, where wind is broadly speaking now competitive with coal-fired generation for new stations, not for old coal-fired stations which are fully depreciated. But nevertheless, across the world, in most circumstances, even in sunny places like south of Spain, photovoltaics require subsidy. In Western Scotland, with its enormous wind resources, onshore wind still requires a subsidy above and beyond fossil fuels. Alex has made the point that the cost of renewables is falling. And any rational society would look at that and say, clearly, at some point in the future, renewables are going to be cheaper than coal. But let me tell you, and I think everybody in the room knows this, that of the electricity generating capacity added in the world last year, over 50% was coal. And that's happening because coal is still the cheapest fuel in most parts of the world. We cannot avoid that. Even those of us who spend all our time trying to encourage the growth of renewables, and I'm afraid to say that's how I spend my time, have to accept the fact that in most parts of the world, renewable technologies are still more expensive, and if we put them onto our energy grid, we have two problems. One, we increase the price of electricity to individual consumers, and they are beginning to get fed up with this. And two, we're going to find it very difficult to cope with people's assumption that when they turn the light on, the light goes on. The problem with wind, and I know this coming from a country with very, very sharp swings in wind generation, if we rely too much on wind, we are not going to be able to satisfy people's needs for immediate access to electricity. I'm not saying that's an insoluble problem, and I've got some more slides to talk about that. But it's all those of us who are proponents, who want renewables to happen, have to accept that at the moment they make very little or very limited financial sense. We have to work to make that different. We cannot simply force individual consumers, voters, to spend more than they have to on electricity or other forms of energy. The evidence from across Europe is that it isn't working.
May I?
And then we finish.
I believe our case, at least in Spain, it's not exactly like this, because we have several studies, very serious ones, which are demonstrating that we achieved grid parity with PV in Spain. Means the price of producing electricity with PV, it's similar or even cheaper than the what we call the energy mix of the conventional production. Of course, the question of intermittency is the other one. We can discuss also on this. But yeah, I think we have this situation where the renewables are competitive, especially solar PV. And if someone do not believe in these studies, you need just a very simple check, which means Spanish government, which is clearly defending conventional utilities, which are, by the way, losing money in all Europe because of their old-fashioned business model. So Spanish government is punishing now. We switch from benefits and having feed-in tariff to punishment to those who are producing with renewables. So if one conservative government who is defending conventional utility is punishing solar, means solar is competitive. If not, no reason to punish it. I mean, the market is stuck now. There is no new investment in solar because there is a tax to produce by solar, not let's say feed-in or not bonus, but punishment to produce like this. So it's so clear evidence that you don't need to be physician or mathematician to understand. So here we have very interesting situation, and it's I'm very curious to know whether this is a new trend that the other European countries are going to follow, or are we doing something which is completely nonsense? Because my first analysis was, well, this is completely stupid because all the countries are, well, not anymore subsidizing or paying a feed-in as it used to be, but encouraging self-consumption. Yeah. This is a general picture. But in Spain, we are even, let's say, trying to ban self-consumption. But then I said, come on, but if you think that 20 biggest utilities in Europe lost half of their value in stock markets in last 5 years, then and you know how strong is this lobby in European Commission. You said, come on, maybe we are just la vanguardia. We are just front runners in a way. So everybody is going to behave like Spanish government. I don't know.
But the future.
It's strange situation.
Very quick. You want well, okay. But very quick because after that Bruno also wants to
ask question. No,
yeah, Bruno. Bruno Sauer. He's the technical director of the Green Building Council.
And something else. I mean, not only that. Chris, I don't want to get to interrupt maybe your answer to another previous question. It's not really a question that I have, and something for both and maybe for more people. One of the interesting moments of the debate for me was that on the moment that you drop the numbers and the economical discussion and you go to a wider perspective on the whole problem of energy, I have a small impression that we are considering society a little bit as unchangeable in mentality, and I think that's not the case, or not that much. Yeah, I think it's not that much as we think. For instance, if you have a look on the latest information in certain countries on how many people are going to get their driving license, before maybe 10 or 20 years ago, everybody with 18 years was just going up. The first thing what they do is driving license. Nowadays, if you look to these numbers, there are many people really 18, 20, 22 years, who are not interested in having a driving license. That means indirectly that, for instance, having a car and transport by car is not that important anymore in society. So I wonder why political world, in this sense, is not understanding these numbers and saying, look, let's really go for certain kind of imposement, obligation, or changing our built environment where the place for a car is not that important anymore, and try to do indirectly something on energy demand. And that's just one example. Or why don't we look to health information, health costs? What's the cost of air pollution on cancer and all these things? Which is not directly economical thing on buying energy or producing energy. It's just an indirect cost on what's CO2 and pollution. Or why don't we look to these big events that are happening and which are I think still not really quantifiable, like all the inundations and floodings from climate change. What's the cost to society, which is indirectly linked with or directly linked with energy consumption?
Confidence in progress.
Yes, I think people are conscious of that, and they're understanding these things. We don't need so many numbers. So in that sense, I think society can change somewhere. We shouldn't be maybe a little bit more hopeful and respectful towards society, that saying that people are not that stupid in the street. Yeah?
Yeah. Bruno, I completely agree with you, but I mean, society is not stupid at all. I'm being an engineer and studying technical part of energy for 4 years. For decades, now I believe that to deal with energy, the best thing is to be anthropologist or sociologist. But still, we put some numbers because we need to fight against greenwashing and green marketing. You talked yesterday. And then I said, I mean, there are 3 physical limits, and we need to be conscious about these physical limits. I mean, power density means energy you can harvest from renewables is limited. And I prefer to say this and to treat with this fact than to generate the image that with a few square meters of silicium, we are going to change the world. So I think the numbers are very important, few numbers, but right and rigorous numbers. And then you're absolutely right. I mean, what is most important is the social behavior of the people. And here is the question, I mean, but we still don't have a business model which is going to promote less consumption. Look at marketing, look at the advertisement. Everything is focused to incentivize consumption and to use more, and everything is, I mean, how can we change and switch all our creative capacity of marketing to advertise to use less? I mean, it's difficult. But also there are this disruptive technology, disruptive business models, and disruptive social behavior. Here in Barcelona, biking is disruptive social behavior. 10 years ago, who used to bike was crazy, I mean, peraflauta. And now it's, you can see all kind of people, all social, groups biking. And it's perfect, so it can change.
Somebody who already biked through Barcelona up the hills to Terrassa in 1992 was Ruud Lubbers. And I wanted to give him also the word.
Thank you so much for this rich discussion on energy. A couple of remarks. One on the interesting graph on nuclear. The cost has increased. This is very special. How come? Coming from nuclear myself, I like to explain this by the accidents in the world. It started with 3 Mile Island accident in the United States. And then it went on. The good Lord gave us a disaster every few decades. So it went to Chernobyl, and then we went for the tsunami. It helped us. And it urged our specialists to develop nuclear energy more and more safe to the extreme. It's going on. And that is the explanation for this graph. We don't know, of course, where it ends. So this is one remark. So there are ways to change society. This is one. It went that far that Angela Merkel said, enough is enough. I go for the Wende in Germany to reduce nuclear. Why? Because she took it extreme. She said this is unsafe business, and we excluded. I give you another example. As a former politician, there's an interesting difference between the UK and the Netherlands in relation to floods. You see it still. In UK, people complain with the government, can you not do something on my house? There's another flood. It's not safe. You have to do something. Why does it not happen in the Netherlands? Because we had sufficient disasters in the past. especially 1953, there was a big flood, and it influenced the thinking in the Netherlands that to the extreme. When it costs a lot, you have to change your whole water system in the Netherlands. We protected traditionally ourselves to the sea, the oceans. But then we took it more serious. It was not good enough. So the whole of the Netherlands was invested enormously. Money was invested to make the Netherlands safe. So you have not these accidents anymore. It's a simple, comparable with the nuclear. You need disasters to motivate governments to change things. It's another example. So this is what I want to add to the discussion. But it is very tough because I give you another example here in Spain. In Spain, you had a financial crisis. To do everything, they started very idealistically with supporting solar energy, and then it became costful. Now this is not costful anymore because the price went down, as you made clear here in the graphs. But now you have another problem because the electricity companies have their traditional production capacity invested a lot in nuclear even, in coal and gas. It's traditional, and they refuse now to accept that it's so cheap. It might be cheap, but it is very expensive for us, the companies. So they urge the companies, the government, not to accept solar energy in Spain. It's crazy, but this is also part of real life. I give you a last example. As a European Netherlands Prime Minister, we agreed a number of years ago of the European trading system, ETS. And we thought this is a very rational system. We're going to limit the allowances, and we can manipulate it, and we will reduce it in such a way that it is effective to reduce carbon, CO2 prices. So that system was installed. Now we are 5-7 years later, and we can see one thing. It is not happening. Why is it not happening? Because we are still living in a world of business. So business people are very powerful to say, you cannot do this. We have it already very difficult with our companies. And that is killing us. So please, take the climate change not serious. Do not manipulate the price. Use the efficiency gains, which is good and normal, and keep the price low. So this is, in fact, not a political decision. It's a reflection of a world which is dominated by companies who can effectively instruct governments not to do what has to be done. So this element I want to add also to this debate. Thank you.
We have to be optimistic. So we'll continue. Right now we will just take a little, maybe 5 minutes break, but I want to give you the opportunity at least to drink some water or take a coffee or go to the bathroom, and then we continue with Peter Sweetman and Hans Siebelings. Thank you very much.
Thanks.